everybody. Welcome to Deep Dive. Daniel Davis's Deep Dive. This is a live show coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and we have a very special guest with us today. Somebody that you may have heard about a little bit, but based on what I'm about to show you in this story, there's a lot more to his story, and it is Matthew Ho, good friend of mine, somebody I've known for many years. We've broken bread together a bunch of times, not near enough, and I hope we can fix that one of these days. Matthew Ho is the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Group, and former State Department official, former U.S. combat Marine, and just all around great guy. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Hey, Danny. Thanks for having me here. It's good to see you, man.
Man, you know, you and I have a little bit of history. We go all the way back to 2009, and just even before we get started here, because I want to set the stage for all of our viewers so they understand that all the conversation that'll come after that and some of the things that you're going to give on some of the contemporary events here, I want people to know where we came from. So in October of 2009, Matt Ho made a big national splash when he resigned as the senior State Department official in, I believe it was the Zabul province, was it not, Matt? Yeah. In Afghanistan. And he wrote a resignation letter on why he did, and that made a lot of news. And then all of the major media across the country covered it because that was a shock to the system. That's something that had not happened. And Matt, I'm going to get your story here in a second, but I remember you told me that you were really surprised at just how many people did pay attention, but they sure did. And you were on lots of major media in the immediate aftermath of that. And I just want to show a couple of little clips here because some of the things that you said at that time turned out to be way more than just prescient.
Matthew Ho served as a captain in Iraq and later a foreign service officer in Afghanistan. He quit the diplomatic post earlier this year in a dispute over administration policy. You have said that the goal of making sure al-Qaeda doesn't regroup in Afghanistan and launch another terrorist attack is a specious argument. Why?
It is. Particularly since 2001, al-Qaeda has evolved into an organization that doesn't require physical ground or territory. It's an organization that's based on the internet. It does have leadership that is in sanctuary in Pakistan. However, that leadership is primarily more as figureheads right now. So the presence of large amounts of American ground troops in Afghanistan doesn't have any effect on al-Qaeda's operations. If we give them a date that we're going to withdraw, then the Karzai regime will have to negotiate with the Taliban. But that's why I'm arguing for us to negotiate with the Taliban right now, engage them right now and get them to the table so that we can get some type of settlement. So we're not here talking about this in 2012, 2013 after X amount more dead.
Yikes. 2012, 2013, and turned out to be an additional decade after that. But Matt wasn't through then. He also went on Washington Journal and said this.
Our troops are fighting men who are fighting us because we're occupying their valleys and villages. Additionally, we're taking part in a civil war. It's a civil war that's been going on for 30, 35 years in a violent fashion. And the only way to end that civil war is by political settlement. Adding more troops or keeping the same amount of troops we have in there right now will not end the civil war. It'll only prolong it because it doesn't provide any incentive to either side to settle.
The president was telling reporters in Asia this past week that he does not want to leave this to his successor. And they asked him, what is the end game? How would you answer that?
I think the end game is find a political settlement, find a political solution. Right now, I believe our forces in Afghanistan do two things. One, they provide support. They basically prop up the Karzai regime. Because of our support, the Karzai regime has no incentive to negotiate with the opposing side. Additionally, our presence as foreign occupiers so inflames the opposing side, the rural Pashtun side, that they will not settle, they will not negotiate until we leave the country or begin to leave the country. So in order for us to get to any type of political settlement to end that civil war, we need to consider withdrawing our troops.
We need a political settlement. The people on the ground view us as occupiers, and then they join the Taliban, and the regime itself has no motivation to settle as long as we're there, and we need to leave so that then negotiations can happen. Every bit of that actually happened, but more than a decade later in 2023, not even 2022, but man, But I just ask you, when you think back on that time and all the intervening years that went through, what was going through your mind when you saw some of those horrific images when the end actually did come in August of 2021?
I think generally, probably like yourself, Danny, this didn't need to happen. This didn't need to occur. This is the result of our arrogance, our hubris, our ignorance. This is the result of having to pursue military victory primarily for domestic political concerns, right? The refusal of a president to be seen as weak or to have lost Afghanistan. I mean, this goes back decades in American politics, right? It goes back to who lost China in the 1950s. So that type of the reality that occurs in 2021 in Afghanistan is a reality of our making, right? It doesn't occur that way unless we refuse to engage in a deliberate process to bring about stability, to bring about peace, to bring about an end to the fighting. We chose to pursue military victory. We lost. And what we are seeing in 2021 was the consequence of that decision. And when you choose military victory and you don't win, that's what retreat and loss looks like.
And and also just so people understand, I saw a lot of those news reports and certainly was reading all the things that you had talked about. I was at the time a lieutenant colonel in the active U.S. Army and was on tap to deploy to Afghanistan in 2010. So just a number of months after your report here. And I don't even remember how, but I started doing some digging and somehow managed to get a hold of you and ask if you would meet me somewhere. I think in one of the metro stops here in DC is the first time we got together to have lunch and was asking a lot of your opinion. And I remember at that and turned out to be quite a number of meetings we had even before I had deployed there, is that you were telling me a lot of the facts on the ground about the Pashtun, about the history of the place, about how people were being treated, about how their reactions to things were. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of tell us, because you hadn't been on the ground that long, how is it that you had such a commanding grasp of what was going on so early? What is it you saw on the ground that led you to these conclusions?
I think a lot of it was the realization that this war was no fundamentally different than the war in Iraq, that you were dealing with a resistance and insurgency inspired by foreign occupation and made worse by a corrupt and predatory government, a failure of a divide and conquer occupation policy, which is what we pursued in Iraq and which is what we pursued in Afghanistan. Of course, we can sit here all day and compare and contrast Afghanistan and Iraq, the people, the geography, the culture, the histories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is at the end of the day, when you look at it, you say, what's the most important thing here? And that was that the United States military was occupying those countries and keeping in place corrupt and predatory governments. I certainly always took my professional studies seriously. We can get into this, I think, maybe later, talking about the evolution of that in terms of the U.S. military. Certainly, I could talk about how I wrote a piece a few years about this, about, say, the evolution of the required reading list for Marine Corps officers and staff non-commissioned officers, in the sense of how it went from a very critical list when I was a lieutenant in the late 90s to what it is now, which is just a collection of books that are hagiographies and celebrate the successes of the last 2 decades, right? Yeah. So the reading list for cheerleaders and sycophants, and so, but then also too, I think with my position in Afghanistan as a political officer at the State Department, I was able to talk to a lot of people. I was able to get perspectives and was open to it in a way that many others, because of their positions, don't have that opportunity. So I was grateful for that.
So that was helpful. So on that point, a couple of things that I want to ask. So the first one is, you specifically cited in your resignation letter that the Obama strategy was a problem. So I wonder if you can real briefly say what you understood the strategy to be when you actually were deployed there, and then what you saw and what he said that you thought it didn't match and it's not going to work, that was so strong that you would resign.
Well, the strategy was the counterinsurgency strategy, a clear hold build, so that we would go into areas, hold the areas, and then we would build up Afghan security services, Afghan government, Afghan infrastructure. We would win the hearts and minds of the local people.
Yeah.
That was completely dissonant and compartmentalized from the context of the conflict. The To say something about Afghanistan as having been in, at that point, a 35-year-old civil war, because remember, the king is deposed in 1973,
Right.
right? That was heretical. That was blasphemous to bring up any type of antecedent to what was occurring here. History started on October sorry, I've got Israel and Palestine on my mind, on September 11th. But we're having
Yeah.
the same problem with that as well, with in terms of history starts on October 7th, right?
Right. Yeah,
I
we're going
mean,
to talk about that in a minute.
in with Afghanistan, history starts September 11th, 2001. And, I mean, so a lot of it was just this is not recognizable in terms of, I think as well, too, there was just what was being recommended. These counterinsurgency techniques had been done before by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And by and large, the Soviets had done the same thing too. This idea of nation building, the Soviets in the 80s had embarked on a massive campaign. They had, if I remember correctly, 100,000 civilian advisors in Afghanistan, engineers, doctors, people doing all the nation building work. Building the government and trying to connect people to the government. They had done that. They had called it maybe something different, and they certainly were brutal in their military operations. Yeah. But they had tried that. And then we had tried that. Everywhere I went in Afghanistan, like you, when you were there in 2010, I was fortunate in that I was in a number of places. So I was in 5 or 6 provinces. I saw that, had the opportunity. And also, too, my position was unique, and where I would go out, just like you, I would go out on foot patrols. Yeah. Right. So you'd be out with specialists and sergeants and lieutenants on foot patrols. And at the same time, I'd be in a meeting with the ambassador and the 4-star, right? Or the 3 stars.
And did you see I guess, incompatible view of what you saw on the ground and what those people were thinking and saying? Were they aware of it, or were they really disconnected and didn't really understand the ground truth?
Oh, on the diplomatic side, they got it. I can tell you that. I mean, I can tell you, when I resigned, my peers, the other political officers throughout the most violent provinces in Afghanistan at that part. And so Helmand, Kandahar, Uruzgan, Nangarhar, Nuristan. When I resigned and my resignation letter went around through the embassy before it got shot back to Washington, D.C., all these folks agreed with me. When I was leaving, I flew up to Kabul with the guy from Uruzgan and one of the guys from Kandahar, and they couldn't stop talking about how much they agree with me. And I get to the embassy, and it's the same thing. Ambassador Eikenberry wants me to stay on. He wants to be his personal liaison to General McChrystal, and just say everything I said in that resignation letter to him every day. That's what Eikenberry wants. And he tells him, if you stay, I'll write the foreword to this resignation letter when I get back. And I heard that from other deputy ambassadors.
So that's something I want to ask about, because this is an important point. During my time there, I similarly talked to all kinds of people on the ground at various levels who also recognized everything that I did, everything that I subsequently said in public, everything that you said, they recognized because they lived it. They saw it on the ground. But most of the people that I talked to, like the vast majority, actually said, but what can I do about it? Right.
Yes.
I mean, especially the military guys are like, so I'm just going to do my job, keep my guys safe, kill Taliban bad guys until it's time to hand over to the next group and then go home. And that was it. So there was no intention to do anything else. But you saw those same things, and you went to the extraordinary length to resign, as opposed to just saying, I'm just going to do the best I can. I wonder if you can tell us why. Why did you take that action?
Well, I was intellectually and morally broken. I had done the 2 deployments to Iraq. I had done a lot of work in DC regarding the Iraq and Afghan wars, and I was just intellectually and morally broken. I mean, I was suicidal before I got to Afghanistan over my involvement in the Iraq war, and so that was a lot of it. So it came from a despondency and despair. And then there were other things too. I was in a position as a political officer, as a State Department officer on a provincial reconstruction team, where I didn't have anyone else responsible for. even the interpreters that I worked with, they didn't, belong to me. And folks who are in the military understand what I'm talking about here. I didn't have that responsibility going down towards people, right? In the sense of that, I heard from a lot of guys. This is the reason why I jump on a chance to go back to Iraq my second time, is because I'm a better officer than those guys, and I've got a better chance of bringing some of those kids back home alive than that guy does. Right. I mean, so all those reasons and rationalizations and excuses for people to continue with this and not speak out. I certainly saw that. But when I get to Afghanistan, again, I'm just at such a place emotionally, mentally, spiritually, intellectually, because having to go along with this, that it's going to work. It's not going to work. You're telling me we've tried this before. And even President Obama knows that. There's a great passage in Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, where Obama says that. He says, you've been doing this already. You've been doing this counterinsurgency. Show me one place where it worked. You can't. And then he goes along with it. But I mean, we knew that. We saw that, right? I mean, you didn't go any place in Afghanistan, where they hadn't been doing counterinsurgency. They hadn't been doing those types of, we're going to connect the people to the local population, the government. We're going to provide security, on and on and on. So I think that was.
Sorry, I want to back up just a little bit, because this is going to be relevant in just a second, to your time in Iraq. So prior to this, because obviously that, as you just said, tailed into it. Now, as you may correct me, my memory's a bit fuzzy. You were a combat engineer, company commander in Iraq, right? And you were, as I recall, in some of the bigger battles. Did you have something to do with the Fallujah fight? Am I thinking right?
No, I was my first time in Iraq when I was on a State Department team. Actually, I was there during the second Fallujah campaign. I got there right after the first Fallujah campaign. So I took part from a political and reconstructive point in the shaping operations in the Tigris River Valley, north of Baghdad, for the Al-Farj campaign, the November 2004 Fallujah campaign.
Okay.
So we're certainly familiar with it from that sense, but certainly took part in a number of operations. In both of those deployments, just as we were talking about with my time in Afghanistan, my billet, my position there was such that gave me such a wide perspective, both horizontally and vertically. So even when I'm a company commander with the Marine Corps over there, I'm also a regimental engineer, in charge of the counter IED fight, among other things, throughout all of Western Anbar province. Right. So because of that, I see everything in my battle space. But because I'm also the regimental engineer, I'm involved with my higher headquarters, which was the MEF, the Marine Expeditionary Force. And because of that, then I see not just which is in the MEF battle space, but I'm also seeing what's going on throughout all of Iraq, right? So at the same time, I've got I got kids out on the roads doing route clearance, looking for pressure plate IEDs in Western Anbar, in Haditha or Heat or whatnot. I'm also understanding what the army is going through in Baghdad, facing, EFPs, explosive foreign penetrators, right? So that's just an example of the counter ID stuff. So having that perspective, and certainly in my first time there, I had a lot of varied and disparate perspective that, then informs me, and I think that the understanding, the confidence I had to say, this is not going to work. There's no way this is going to work. I am being intellectually dishonest here. I can't keep making excuses, was informed by again, being able to see things on horizontally and vertically that a lot of guys and gals don't get the opportunity. And I had that in all three deployments. I also had the opportunity, I wouldn't say the opportunity, that's probably the misfortune maybe, to have been at senior levels back in DC as well, whether it's Secretary of Navy's office or on the Iraq desk at the State Department. And so I had no confidence that those institutions were going to do the right thing. And I had no confidence in the personalities. And even so in 2009, when you could have said, like, well, the Obama administration, the Democrats are in now, it's a new group. They were the same people, different faces, different names, same people, the same. And same thing in Afghanistan. We can go all day about how Afghanistan and Iraq is different, but at the end of the day, what really matters? So you combine all that, the perspective I had, my experiences, and then really importantly, we touched a little bit about this, the books I have read, the knowledge, the education I had partaken in, whether it's directly asking people about things or reading. And that gave me the confidence to say, I think very much like you, because you were very confident as well in your assessment. And where does that come from? right? You mean, so, and a lot of guys don't have that. I think a lot of guys didn't have that confidence.
Confidence,
Who am
yeah.
I? I'm just a major. I'm just a sergeant first class. I'm just a chief petty officer who's over here on a, assigned over here on this bill. So, I mean, I think all that rolls together and you get to a breaking point, right? And you were there as well. You did the same thing,
But now the reason why I went into such detail a lot of these things, and you've added some additional clarity. I want to bring things up to the current situation here, because a lot of the experience that you've had, a lot of the things that you've seen, are very relevant to what's going on in Israel right now and what's about to happen in Israel. Just in case you haven't even seen the news or seen any of our viewers, it appears that the first stage of the Israeli ground incursion has begun. We have a couple of reports I want to show you bits of here about what happened earlier today. You can see here there's some of these tanks are penetrating the berm. They're attacking positions that are just on the other side. When Gary was showing me this earlier, I actually thought he was showing me file footage from Desert Storm, because this is exactly what we did when we crossed the berm and went into Iraq here. But this is actually from earlier today. And then Gary, if you can play the IDF spokesman when he was talking just hours ago.
Tanks going in and then possibly coming out again. What can you tell us about what's actually happened?
Indeed, the operation is broadening in its effectiveness. Last night, we conducted clearing operations in order to remove potential threats that could impede on a ground operation that is potentially coming. The forces targeted Hamas positions, engaged with Hamas anti-tank squad. And indeed, the idea is to remove all threats that could potentially disrupt the military operation. It is part of our ongoing and our expanding of our operation, and it is indeed part of the preparations that we are taking. It was a large force, larger than we've seen, but it was still localized in its efforts, in effective escapes of areas, which was limited in its scope. Tanks, infantry, under the cover of Air Force and protection of the Air Force. And indeed, there was a ground mobilization, a limited ground mobilization at that.
And how far in did you go? And were there any civilians that were seen in those areas?
I have not received any reports of civilians. It was probably around a kilometer, maybe just a bit more.
Okay, so it appears that the ground incursion is now, the big ground incursion is probably hours, maybe a day or two away, because you're not going to start that unless you're about ready to launch in there. So based on all that you have seen, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or now in the Middle East, a lot of these things are similar. And especially since you had anything at all to do with the Battle of Fallujah, or in some of these other in Ramadi with the awakening and all those battles that took place there, a lot of in civilian areas. What do you think is going to happen? We're going to talk about, by the way, the humanitarian portion of this, because you can't extract it separately. But first of all, I want to look at the military stuff. Based on your combat experience, what do you think is going to happen? Is the Israeli Defense Force going to be successful to destroy Hamas and bring peace to Israel?
Well, first, I think we could do a whole episode comparing and contrasting Ukraine's breaching efforts with the Israeli breaching efforts. Right. I mean, and then by no means is that an apples to apples comparison. Right. Very, very different situations. But you see how the Israelis are approaching this, and they've had to take time to mobilize their forces. They've had to get everything in order. There's been a lot of critiques about the Israeli army, that they simply don't have the experience, the readiness, the know-how to launch such an urban assault. And that's, a critique I've seen more and more. And so the delays we've seen as well in terms of launching this, Wall Street Journal spoke about this yesterday, but you've seen it from other places as well, seen primarily to allow, or not primarily, but also to allow the Americans to get more assets, more resources, more personnel,
air defense, especially
more air defenses. Right. I saw that we just sent the Maryland National Guard F-16 squadron went over there. So now we've got 6 land-based attack squadrons in the area, right? In addition to the 2 carrier battle groups that are there, plus all the other ships and probably a couple submarines with 150 Tomahawks each. So there's a lot of
firepower,
of firepower, but yeah, particularly to get those American air defense systems there. So what the Israelis are looking at here, and you have to wonder what are they walking into, in the sense that Hamas knew that they would have such a repercussion, such a retaliation. I mean, the Israeli senior members of the Israeli government, as well throughout all other elements of Israeli political and media and military society, have spoken about the need for some type of end to the Gaza problem. They've wanted this opportunity, right, to go in and do what and finish the Gaza problem and finish the Hamas problem for quite a while. And so Hamas, knowing that, as they had to have understood that this would be the result, that you're doing exactly, which is a violation of one of the first principles of military warfare, right? Don't do what your enemy wants you to do. At the same time, too, Hamas has had 15 years to put a deliberate defense in depth and to plan for this and prepare for this. I would imagine their stockpiles. We've all heard about the tunnels underground, and whether they're 6 meters, 10 meters, 30 meters underground, who knows? But the amount of time they've had to stockpile and prepare themselves. And so what the Israelis are moving into, is this is Hamas looking as a chance to trap the Israelis into a bloody urban battle that lasts for months, that can never be fully resolved without basically garrisoning all of Gaza City, all of North Gaza, which would require 30,000 Israeli troops plus collaboration forces, right? I mean, like, so the scale of what Israel is walking into here is this Hamas's way of trying to humiliate Israel, and then by doing so as well, really cementing their place among the Palestinian people as the heroes of history, so to speak, as being the resistance movement. Of course, throwing a huge wrench into the whole Arab-Israeli normalization process. All these things you roll into, and you say, this is what comes out of assaulting into the most densely populated place in the world. Those are the larger geopolitical.
Netanyahu has said his actual objective is the eradication of Hamas. And of course, as you know better than anybody, it's also, they got a military wing, but a political wing. They actually are the government that runs there. So to wipe all of them out is a pretty large number of people. Right. So I'm not sure how they're going to do that. But the question is going to be,
importantly too, Danny, it's Hamas is, well, it's in their name, the Islamic resistance movement. That's what Hamas stands for. That's what it means, right? So this idea that you're going to wipe out resistance, how are you going to do that? It's an idea, right?
Then can the Israeli Defense Forces militarily defeat the idea of Hamas as well as the physical Hamas? Can they do it?
I think, honestly, and we're seeing this more and more from statements of them. There's been some documents that were reported by Mondoweiss and Israeli outlets as well, showing that this is an ethnic cleansing campaign. The goal is to push the problem to the other side of the Egyptian border. And they're actually, if you look at the funding request from President Biden, that $105 billion, you go down into the Israel section of that, the $14 billion for Israel. There is, in the humanitarian section as well, there are references in there for the United States to provide money to establish camps in Egypt to support displaced Gazans. And we all know that once they go to Egypt, they're never coming back in.
Well, and that's the next question I was going to ask. So Egypt and Jordan have been coming under a lot of pressure and contempt, actually, from many Western sources, because they, quote, won't accept any Palestinian refugees, like they're trying to keep them out, and they don't want to help the Palestinians out. Is that the reason why that they don't want to? And does Egypt and Jordan deserve condemnation for not letting the Palestinians in their country?
Well, I think we should be able to condemn Egypt for bribing and owning a U.S. senator, for massacring their own civilians, right? For jailing thousands of political prisoners, journalists, human rights workers, right? There's all kinds of reasons to condemn Egypt. And the idea that the dictator Sisi is going to do the right thing here for humanitarian reasons, right? I mean, I think we have to stop ourselves and say, what are we saying here? But I think there's two reasons why. Two main reasons I think you can kind of look at this and say, why doesn't Egypt do it? One is because then they would be partaking in Israel's ethnic cleansing. They would be a participant in that. They don't want to see that. They don't want to take part in that. And it would be politically so damaging to the Egyptian government to do that, the Egyptian people and people throughout the Arab world would understand what's occurring here. You're never going to let those people back in. This is ethnic cleansing. You're forcibly migrating people through violence. The other aspect of it is why Egypt doesn't want them there is because they don't want Hamas. Hamas is going to be no friend of the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government has enforced a blockade itself on Gaza for years now. They've gone along with Israel, right? Israel tells Egypt what Egypt can and can let into Gaza. So to Hamas, they view Egypt as collaborating with Israel, as betraying them, as betraying Muslim people, betraying the Palestinians, particularly this government under Sisi. And then, of course, just again, the nature of Hamas as a reactionary religious movement, a resistance movement, but a reactionary religious one. Well, and particularly an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. We all know how this is, right? I mean, why would the Egyptians want that in their country? I mean, maybe Hamas wouldn't hate the Egyptians as much as they hate Israel, but I think that would be a distinction without any real difference.
Bottom line is this is so complicated, and there's no good actors out here. I don't know that any of these players are good.
Right.
And there's various stages of evil, and that depends upon your perspective of what's evil and what's good anyway. But let's look at the next part of this, which is the people kind of in the middle. Now, the Israeli civilians were the first victims of this when Hamas came across and just slaughtered so many innocent people. I mean, the most egregious of which was that concert where people were just literally mowed down. They weren't even, they weren't collateral damage. They were the targets themselves. So that understandably got the anger and the unbelievable emotions from so many in the West, and obviously in all of Israel. So it's understandable why that they would want to go into the Gaza Strip to punish those people who did it. However, at the same time, as innocent as those people in Israel were, also the people in the Palestine were, who are already, oppressed from decades of time in the Gaza Strip. And now then with, not even now then, up to this point, depending on whose numbers you want to believe, there are several thousand, 6,000 to 7,000 Palestinians who have been killed, to include 2,000 children. Now, anyone who can say, yes, Israel deserves to go after Hamas because of the unbelievable crimes that were committed against their people. But I have some trouble worrying that there seems to be so little compassion for the Palestinian victims who are of this. And yes, a lot of people can say it was, Hamas brought this on themselves. Fair enough. They did. And they also brought this because with the Israeli response, which everyone knew was coming, although it's been really heavy from the air.
Yeah.
But the Palestinian people have been dying in large numbers. Now you go in on the ground here and those numbers could spike quite a bit higher. Why do you think it is that so little compassion on the Palestinian side seems to be, among many of the American commentators?
Oh, I think there are some really base reasons for it. Some really disturbing reasons. I think a lot of it's race. This is right. I mean, let's go back to when the Ukraine war started, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and you had journalists, professional journalists, not just but professionals, people who are working for legacy media, big names, who were saying things about how this doesn't happen to white people. This doesn't happen in civilized countries, right? And so you have this juxtaposition of white versus brown here. And I think that has a real thing. I think also, too, there's an understanding of terrorism in the United States that is hysterical, right? And this goes back, whether it's to 9/11 and George W. Bush and all that, but also to the culture that we existed in, what we grew up in, right? Watching Arnold Schwarzenegger and Chuck Norris movies in the 80s, fighting the terrorists, right? So I think there is something in terms of just a static presence in our society that causes a bias towards Israel. And then, of course, there is the relationship of the United States to Israel, which is clear, overt, the relationship between our politicians. Danny, I've never, if you can think of something else, have you ever seen the American Congress be so supportive for military action than they are now, right? You have to go back to the Gulf of Tonkin crisis in 64. You have to go back to the days after 9/11 to find this type of this cohesion among the American Congress to support military operations. And this is not even an American military operation. So all of that is very disturbing in terms of the decision making here and the integrity of it.
Well, it starts at the top, Matt, because
Right.
yesterday in the Rose Garden, President Biden was talking with the the Australian Prime Minister, and one of the reporters stood up and asked a question related to this Palestinian stuff. Gary, do you have that clip there of when that reporter asked that question?
Israeli forces have killed over 6,000 Palestinians, including 2,700 children. You've previously asked Netanyahu to minimize civilian casualties. Do these numbers say to you that he is ignoring that message?
What they say to me is I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
Because this woman is talking about large numbers of innocent people that have been killed. And the president's response is, yeah, I'm not sure those numbers are right. And, we shouldn't really believe that, as though that we're quibbling over something that's almost inconsequential, whether it's 7,000, 5,000, only 4,000, whatever the number is. Large numbers of people have been killed. And you see whole sections of the city have been wiped out, meaning that, yeah, they moved a lot of them south, but where are they going to go when this is over? And you've probably seen a lot of these where like people are just living just like ants all over, the existing buildings in the South trying to survive. And I don't know how they're going to do that long term, but there just doesn't seem to be any compassion for these innocent civilians on the other side of that line.
It is. It's really, it's very troubling and it's very disturbing. The bloodlust for this, and it fills into all the tropes that the Arabs lie, the Palestinians don't care about the children. These are all human shields. All these really disingenuous and specious explanations for how they're trying to. I saw something the other day. I can't remember which publication it was. Surgically target Hamas.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, like. Yeah,
Do you see any surgery going on in these pictures on the screen right there? That's not surgery.
Israel doesn't even know how many hostages are there. They keep changing the number, right? Let alone they know. I mean, like they didn't see this attack by 1,500 or 2,000 Hamas fighters flying over their fence and paragliders coming that they prepared for probably 18 months or 2 years for. But now they're. I mean, like the whole the mendacity of it all. I think. One, to talk about the casualties, the world has relied upon the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, to report on Palestinian casualties for 15 years now. And there's never been one instance where someone has come up and said, that's overinflated. That's not right. That's exaggerated.
Yeah, I actually saw that earlier today. This is the fifth war that's gone on between them. Their history is that they have been accurate in their numbers.
Exactly. And they have and this is the fifth war. So they have a process. They're very good at counting their dead, right? Right. I mean, that's the reality of it. You could see it took Israel a while to figure out how many people were massacred on October 7th because they're not doing a mass casualty thing like that every couple of years, right? They don't have it's not something that they're used to doing. For the Gazans, they're used to this. They're used to having to count thousands of dead and wounded from airstrikes. I think a lot of us who look at the video, Danny, just like you were saying, of what the bombing, the air campaign against Gaza, I think a lot of us are surprised there's not more dead and wounded. And then there may be, and the numbers are I think about 1,900 people are missing, including 900 children as of this morning. And you look at that and you say that's all that's unaccounted for. There has to be more. You can't rubble that. But I mean, so if anything, I think a lot of us look at this and say those numbers are probably underinflated. But Joe Biden's comments yesterday were really important for three reasons. The first is that it serves as a green light to the Israelis. Go ahead and kill as many as you want. And we really didn't get into the tactical or operational aspects of what the Israeli ground campaign could look like. But certainly we would expect to see some type of kill anything that moves type of campaign. The Israelis have set themselves up. They have told people to move to the south, so they've given warnings, as they say. Now, of course, in the last week, most of the Palestinian casualties have come from the south, from the very place the Israelis said to go to be safe. 65% of
yeah. So on that, Matty, I mean, you see one of the questions from one of our observers right now is just asking, well, why don't they leave? Why don't they get out of that area? What do you say?
They can't leave. The borders are closed. Everything's sealed off. There's nowhere to go. And Israel is bombing indiscriminately. So it's not like you can say they're not going to bomb my house. They're not going to bomb the mosque. They're not going to bomb the church. They're not going to bomb the hospital or the schools or the UN facilities, because they've done all of that over and over again. I mean, when Israel is striking 400 targets a night, dropping bombs, destroying 400 buildings a night, there is nowhere safe to go. And they were told to go south, and they were bombed on the evacuation routes. And then, as I was saying, they are being bombed in southern Gaza. The Israelis have bombed multiple times the Rafah crossing into Egypt. One of the reasons why it took a day after they agreed last week to let in 20 trucks of aid, which is a farce, but it took a day to let them in, was because Israel had bombed the road in front of the crossing, making it unusable, and they had to repair it. So everything that's lost here. But I want to go back to what Biden said, because it's important, because is it a green light for Israel to kill as many as they want, and we, the United States, are going to say, "Oh, those numbers don't count. Don't believe it." Is this also then, secondly, the signal that this is a U.S. official statement, that anything about Palestinian casualties will always have an appendage of the U.S. doesn't believe this, the Gazans lie, the Palestinians lie, Hamas lies, right? And then, of course, we have a media, as we all know in this country, that is going to put that at the end of anything. So 7,000 Palestinians are killed, which was a number today, almost 3,000 children. 7,000 Palestinians killed, comma, the U.S. does not agree with this. The U.S. disputes this. The U.S. says this is a lie. Is that going to be, we're going to see that through history now in publications like the Wall Street Journal, on CNN, right, in Washington Post columns. But the third thing, and I think this is the most important thing of it all, is if you have a commander in chief, you have a president who's going to stand up there and say, I don't believe it, they're lying. Just dismiss facts and reality that he doesn't like. What does that say about his decision-making process? What does that say about the integrity of what's coming out of the White House? You have a president who is going to be making these decisions going forward as we see this ethnic cleansing campaign blossom, as a chance of a regional war only increases by the minute and the hour. You read commentators talking about how Pakistan is saying they will provide nuclear weapons to Turkey. And the Turks are saying we will do everything we can, including militarily, to stop the slaughter in Gaza. I mean, where does this? And then, of course, you've got Russian and U.S. forces in the region. If you listen to, Alexander Mercouris, I've not seen the source, but he's said it a number of times now that the Russians have said in response to aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I guess the Eisenhower's going to the Persian Gulf, but that they are putting MiG-31s over the Black Seas with cruise missiles. Right. I mean, and so you have a president who, in the midst of all this, plus everything that's going on in Ukraine, that's been going on for the last year and a half, and what could potentially happen with China, you have a president who's just going to say, I don't like that. I don't believe it. Doesn't matter. And that's decision making that's going to occur here.
That is a big problem.
That's really, really dangerous. I mean, that's monstrous in terms of its danger.
In some ways, that a lot of people always accuse President Trump of being a terrible decision maker, and we wouldn't want him in charge. But in some ways, the current president is even lower down on that rung. Matt, we're about to run out of time here, but I want to ask you something really important, because it was something inherent in some of your observations that you accurately made during both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And that is understanding the people on the ground. And I'm not just talking about the Palestinians, but the Arab people in the world. And you just touched on a little bit of it there with potentially Pakistan and Turkey. But my question is, if Israel goes in, or once Israel goes in with this ground incursion, and if it turns out to be an even bigger bloodbath, what is going to be the impact on the Arab people in the region, whether that's Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of these? And is there a risk that they turn against us if we continue providing the ammunition for this operation?
I think so. I think you've had that. Let's talk about that last part first. You've had U.S. troops, relatively small number, a few thousand in both Iraq and in Syria for these last several years. And what has been their purposes? And I believe one of the purposes has been exactly this: serve as bait or serve as a tripwire to bring the United States into a larger conflict. There's no denying that we have people in this administration, that people who were in the Trump administration, in the Biden administration, I mean, in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, who want this larger regional war. This goes back to the Project for a New American Century in the 90s, the idea of remaking the Middle East. This was a very important reason for the invasion of Iraq. When I got to Iraq in April of 2004, I was part of the Coalition Provisional Authority at that point, before the U.S. Embassy took over, and people were still talking about this, even a year into that disaster. People, this has started off a little slow, but eventually we're going to have to decide whether we're going to go right or go left next. Talking about whether we're going to go into Iran or into Syria. I heard people talk about that all the time in April of 2004, May of 2004 in Baghdad. I mean, so there, this desire to realize a war that they've wanted for their ideological reasons, for the desire to remake the Middle East, to spread democracy, to put Israel in a primary position, all these different reasons that kind of underline and are the foundation for the neoconservative viewpoints towards the Middle East. And then, of course, the Arab people are, this is a flashpoint for them. This is something that is very deep and very heartfelt and very visceral for them. Their nations have gone to war with Israel several times. There's a history there. So maybe your grandfather fought and died trying to protect the Palestinian people from Israel, as you see it, right? I mean, so those connections, and they see their governments as being corrupt, often predatory, not representative. And if these Arab governments sense that, which they are, because there's been a lot of pushback against Israel on this, they'll have to respond, because they know ultimately, King Abdullah knows ultimately he is precarious. Bashar Assad, of course, will do things for reasons that are understandable in the context of the last couple of decades, but also too, he does not need any of his people saying this guy won't support the Palestinians. He's a betrayer to us in our country, in our way of life, and our religion, and everything else. But the point you brought, Danny, about the personal aspect about this, about you see that with the Hamas fighters that breached the fence line 2.5 weeks ago. They were going into Israeli towns and villages that had once been Palestinian towns and villages. These were young fighters who had never been outside of Gaza. Most of them, or almost all of them, probably had never left Gaza before. And now they were going into the towns and villages that their grandparents and great-grandparents had been violently expelled from. And many of them had family that had been killed by Israeli airstrikes, that had been hurt by the blockade and the siege.
Yeah.
So you put yourself in
first 4
perspective.
wars.
Yeah, what would you do? And all the this is what bothers me, I think, the most. All these guys who were over in Iraq and over in Afghanistan, and who thump their chest as if they're some part of a Spartan military, or that they're some type of modern day. I saw someone say this the other day, thought was really good. Modern day Knights Templar and everything else. And you didn't learn anything. What did you learn? You occupy a people, there's going to be resistance. There's going to be pushback. In the same vein, too, the atrocities that occur, and this doesn't condone what happened on October 7th or taking of hostages. I mean, I think those are not just strategic errors, but morally abhorrent. But what does that do for the Israelis? That starts the cycle of violence fresh again. When I was in Palestine several years ago, I met a settler, and he was yelling at me more than anything else. But he was going on about how his grandfather's home had been burnt down by the Palestinians, right? So you have this, what can be called ancestral trauma, that kicks in and is very real and can't be dismissed as like psychiatric gobbledygook. This is real stuff. I mean, and certainly I think for people to get this, put yourself in their shoes, put yourself in the Gazan shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of those in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. In the West Bank, 100 Palestinians have been killed in the last 2.5 weeks. More than 1,000 have been arrested. Prior to October 7th, you had one Palestinian being shot dead by Israeli security services every day in the West Bank under occupation. And anyone, if you took part in Iraq or Afghanistan, you know what that does. It just drives people straight to the resistance, straight to the insurgency. On the same vein, then, what the Israelis see happen, what they experience, their ancestral trauma, but now the current horror of October 7th, what's that going to do to their, I mean, where are they at, right? I mean, so not understanding it on a personal level, I think, makes it really difficult to approach this. And it's what often comes about, where you can't simply you can't simply only be subjective. You can't simply only be objective if you're trying to analyze a situation and figure out what you would do, how you would respond. You have to put yourself in other people's shoes.
That is so important, Matt. And I want to reinforce this and hit it hard before we get off the air here. And that is, I see a troubling trend in the United States in that we love to be pro-Israel for absolutely understandable and reasonable reasons. I mean, we've been a friend to them for many years. It's good people that live there, and we've just seen them suffer a horrible atrocity. But there is more interest involved than just the Israeli side. And in fact, even if you only care about the Israeli side, they have got to be measured in what they do, because if they go too far in this direction, if we completely discount all those things you just mentioned on the Palestinian side or in the Arab side writ large in the region there, then we could potentially encourage Israel to go in a direction that would undermine their own support, their own interest in the war and in the region, and undermine our own interest. And God forbid if this continues to go in a bad direction and then sparks a much wider war where every one of us lose. There is so much at stake here that we've got to get right. This is not about moral equivalency or any of that. I keep seeing that argument pop up. Yeah. It just aggravates me, because so many people want to say that it's like Hamas and Palestine are synonymous. So you can't take any of their side. You have to just take Israel's side, and that anything they do is fine. And it's not fine. It's not fine morally. It's not fine for Israel. Their own interests are undermined if we keep going in that direction. And I'm so glad you brought a lot of those things up, because we need to see this is not about taking sides. This is about what can we do to end the bloodshed and bring it, I won't say peace, but at least stability, and end the risk of a wider war for all people involved.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of what are the options here? Where does it go forward? And people continue they want to have a semantic argument, and you see that even with the policymakers, with what's happening in the UN. These competing resolutions for a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. And I imagine there might be some differences, but at the end of it, what are we trying to accomplish here? And then if you want, the October 7th attacks were inevitable. They were, as horrific as they were inevitable. There are reasons for why they were, quote, successful, unquote, a lot of Israeli military intelligence failures and so forth. But, there's going to be something else that's going to occur after this. And that's why I think there is the Israeli desire to carry through this ethnic cleansing, to end the Gaza problem once and for all, to put them into Egypt, to force them out, and then build a giant wall and keep them out. And that's the end of the problem type of thing, right? Because the only other option, you mean what you can do, again, garrison Gaza, you're going to have an Israeli infantry division there forever, right? I mean, and enduring that type of thing. The Israelis did that in Lebanon. They're doing that in the occupied West Bank. Why would they want to take that on? But then the other option, the option I think you and I want to see, what most people, and according to public opinion polls, the majority of Americans want to see, is a political process that answers the grievances of the Palestinian people. Because if you do not answer their grievances, I remember one time having this conversation with this person about Afghanistan, and she was going on about development and about introducing potatoes to grow there or something like that. And, and just like, how is that going to answer the grievance of a civil war that's been going on for decades now? Planting potatoes and getting a couple bucks in people's pocket, that's going to answer the decades-long grievances of oppressed and and beaten people. Really? You know, I mean, like, so we have that type of mindset where somehow it's just about economic incentives. And certainly that's what Israel tried. Netanyahu was doing that with Hamas. I'm going to let the Qataris give them briefcases of cash. We're going to throw them a few work permits and try and bribe them. And that'll keep them happy, because in the end, it's all about money for everybody. And because that was our approach in Iraq and Afghanistan, that didn't work. We'll just buy these folks off, right? That was like the whole reconciliation process that occurred a number of times that completely failed every time, because these young men are not fighting us because they want money. They're fighting us because we killed family members, you know, and we're occupying them. And in Afghanistan's case, and also in Iraq, but, you know, they have a history of my parents and my father and grandfather fought the Soviets, great grandfather chased the British out, you know. So now you're tapping into something that is incredibly important, the ethos, the mythology, the identification of a people. And so, you know, I think that's, again, why did Hamas do this? That might be part of it. Hamas wants to make sure of that, having that identity, right?
It is, you know, and I'm afraid we're out of time right now, because we have just scratched the surface a lot, much more we could say, and I definitely want to have you back on to continue this conversation. But I know you've got to go somewhere, and I think we've got some other folks have something else has to be going on here in a second. So we'll leave it there for now. Matt, so grateful. You've provided such a better understanding of this entire conflict situation. We're very grateful for your service to our nation, not just in uniform, but in all the ways you've done, and the how much you care about people. You care about Israelis, you care about Palestinians, you care about the Iraqis, all the people that we've ever been around. It's your humanity that I've always most admired about you, and I'm grateful to call you a friend. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. And same thing to you, my friend. Thank you.
We will see you next time on Deep Dive.